Good morning. Thank you for coming. Well, as you know, the title of my talk is called Overcoming Intellectual Barriers in Understanding Jane's theory. And these are thoughts, actually, that have emerged within my own consciousness over the years when I got enough courage to bring up Jane's thinking with some of my colleagues and some students. And so this is sort of based on certain reactions. In any case, the origin of consciousness. In this book, Julian Jaynes presents a number of startling and controversial claims about the nature of psyche, specifically consciousness. His conclusions may ultimately be proven incorrect, partially correct, or entirely correct. However, before we can even begin to assess his assertions, we must reach a clear consensus on what he was attempting to accomplish in his work. In order to do this, we must navigate our way through a maze of misguided assumptions, mistaken suppositions, and misleading habits of thought. I have noticed that when discussing the ideas of James, there is a labyrinth of misconceptions built up by the disciplinary premise of academic fields and the stubborn ideas embedded in confusing terminology. Academic disciplines have their own language. Therefore, it behooves us to carefully pay attention to the universe of meanings each idiom generates. In addition, recognizing the power of words is crucial, since they implicitly shape our everyday thinking and assumptions. So, if you follow the handout, what I'll do from now on is go down the 6 barriers. The first barrier, a lack of amazement at the very existence of consciousness, is probably the most difficult to discuss. Why? The very act of appreciating consciousness rests on an intuition. Without putting too fine a point on it, you either get it or you do not. Many assume consciousness is a type of perceptual response to the environment, or consider it a vague thought process generated by brain activity that even our pets have. In other words, because many of us take consciousness for granted, we do not realize its extraordinary singularity in history. The second barrier concerns the very word consciousness itself. In English, consciousness has 5 very different meanings. 1, to describe the physiological state of not sleeping. 2, the physiological state of not being in a coma. 3, the mutual self-awareness of a group, for example, national consciousness, class consciousness. 4, a vague usage used to describe cognition, perception, or awareness. Some people use this word, it's not clear what they mean sometimes. And then, of course, finally, the word used in the Janesian sense that I think we're aware of. Years ago, Professor Jaynes himself acknowledged that the vagueness and polysemantics of the term consciousness were potentially misleading. After considering this troublesome and ambiguous word for many years, I have, perhaps rather presumptuously, decided to use the term interiority in place of consciousness. Interiority, or perhaps we might say conscious interiority, denotes a spatialness, or the belief in a mental space that exists in the head in which a self moves about and psychological events and processes transpire. Hopefully, the use of this word, and of course other people might have another suggestion, will help inject some conceptual clarity into our discussions. Okay, the third barrier concerns our assumption that cognition is mainly conscious. The mystery is not why the unconscious exists, but rather why does conscious interiority exist? After all, experimentation has demonstrated that interiority is unnecessary for most forms of mentation. Theoretical work on non-conscious cognition began in the 19th century when 2 counterintuitive and inconvenient facts became clear. First, interiority does not reflect experiences we have of the external world. To quote Jaynes, your consciousness is not identical to what your senses perceive. Second, the I of our subjective interiorized experiences is not the initiator of our actions. Our non-conscious psyche is, or the self of our interiority portrays itself as the initiator, but it is not, as events have already started by the time consciousness occurs. Mental activity below the radar screen of experience has variously been called unconscious, subconscious, and preconscious, but I use non-conscious to avoid unnecessary Freudian associations. The failure to appreciate the difference between conscious interiority, a small product of cognition, and non-consciousness, most of cognition, has generated much confusion. Unfortunately, early researchers, to quote another observer on this, equated cognition with conscious cognition. They have been cleaning up after this misconception ever since. Some intellectual historical perspective is needed to illustrate how researchers, incapable of, quote, seeing mental activity while introspecting, were forced to look behind and below interiority for invisible mental processes. The non-conscious became one of the great themes of the 19th century. The question is why it has not received more sustained attention throughout the centuries. The answer is that if people did not theorize about interiority, or what is introspectable, then there was little need to consider what was not introspectable. We must ask, to quote another observer, why the idea of unconscious mental processes were conceivable around 1700, topical around 1800, and widespread by around 1900. Well, in any case, something like the non-conscious has manifested its ghostly presence in the corners of the edifice of Western thought throughout history. A tradition of inquiry into what we might call non-conscious mental processes can arguably be traced back to St. Augustine, who wrote of, to quote, a vast and boundless subterranean shrine. Who has ever reached the bottom of it? Imagine the plains, caverns, and abysses of my memory. They are innumerable and are innumerably full of innumerable kinds of things. Well over a millennium later, the philosopher Leibniz wrote about what he called petite perceptions, or countless imperceptible experiences that, though obscure and unconsciously registered, taken together constitute psyche. In English, the word unconscious first appeared in 1712, meaning unaware, lacking conscious thought. In 1860, the meaning of temporarily insensible, knocked out, was added. The noun unconscious appeared in 1884. Subconscious, meaning not wholly conscious, was first used in 1823. Its more familiar sense as a noun appeared in 1886, though subconsciousness was used from 1874. Preconscious was used from 1860. Much of the earlier research on non-conscious cognition was rooted in physiological studies and questions about sensations. Other insights came from methodological problems associated with introspectionism and psychological self-examination. The philosopher Herbart and the philosopher and physicist Fechner wrote about the limen of consciousness, and the physiologist and physicist Hermann von Helmholtz noted what he called unconscious inferences. In his book called Mental Physiology, Carpenter spoke of unconscious cerebration. In 1911, the Danish philosopher and psychologist Hofting wrote about, quote, an activity which would otherwise take place with consciousness can, when consciousness is absorbed in something else simultaneously, occur below the threshold of consciousness. The remarkably prolific philosopher Karl von Hartmann wrote a book called The Philosophy of the Unconscious in 1884. This pre-Freudian work had, to quote, an influence throughout Europe that has sometimes been underestimated. But it was through Freud, who was mistakenly credited by some with discovering the subconscious, that the Western world has come to know the non-conscious as something framed within the psychoanalytic paradigm. Somewhat later, Peirce and Jastrow used the notion of abduction, which, quote, draws on unconscious powers in negotiating through everyday life. That was in 1884. Note should also be made of Bryan and Harder's work on what they call the automation of telegraphic skills, 1897, 1899. William James' thoughts on habit, 1890. Solomons and Reeves on automatic writing, 1886. And the subconsciousness and attentive consciousness of Stout, 1929. The entire theoretical thrust of the Würzburg school, established by Kolpe, which centered on imageless thought, may be interpreted as the recognition that much thinking is not introspectable. A member of the Würzburg school, August Messer, with psychological interest, believed consciousness was only the visible tip of the iceberg. Also, the work of the neurologist Charcot, The neurologist Morton Prince and the sadly overlooked and underestimated psychologist Pierre Janet on the non-conscious aspects of hysteria, dissociative disorders, and other pathologies are relevant here. The rise of behaviorism in the early 20th century severely damaged research into non-conscious cognition. The once dominating research agenda of behaviorism, as elucidated by the likes of Watson and Skinner, was to simply deny the evidence of anything not directly visible and measurable. Thus, conscious interiority was not, in their opinion, amenable to scientific inquiry. Beginning in the late 1950s, the so-called cognitive revolution, which acknowledged invisible processes, such as, at least from the perspective of the researcher, introspection, eventually rectified this bizarre view of the human condition. However, psychology has paid a heavy methodological price. This is why Nortranders writes that cognitive science is not particularly concerned with the unconscious. It attempts to understand which logical rules and algorithms are needed in order to describe the human mind. It assumes that there are clear logical rules, not incomprehensible quantities of unconscious calculation. Closer to our own times is the work of Machatoka, who wrote a book called The Unconscious in Social Relations, 1964. The distinction that Pearls and Hefferling and Goodman make between what they call figure and ground, Gedling's discussion of fringe and focusing, the distinction Schifrin and Schneider make between automatic and controlled information processing, Smith's notion of pre-storage and computation, Seller's discussion of different types of inferences, Nasser's ideas on non-pictorial imagery. I am not arguing here that all the above researchers were and still are grappling with exactly the same problem. However, the research agendas of those cited demonstrate enough family resemblances to the conscious versus cognition problem to suggest that, in their own ways, they were grappling with a very similar issue. After an explicit recognition of interiority in the 17th century, it would take several centuries of mystified thinking until we realized that the introspectable space we call conscious interiority was not the mind in its totality, but only a small chamber of a much larger edifice. Invisibility and a spatiality of depth characterized this grand structure, with its unknown palatial halls, concealed quarters, and hidden rooms connected by secret passages that lead to even deeper unexplored caverns. It is on these spaces that the socio-psychological foundations of the human condition stand. And yet, strangely, despite all the evidence for non-conscious cognition, to quote another observer, researchers have been made to jump through methodological hoops to establish non-consciousness beyond any reasonable doubt. In order to make the centrality of non-conscious mental processes more clear, I suggest we discard the conventional Cartesian mind-body duality and replace it with a more fruitful triunity of 1, conscious mind, 2, non-conscious mind, and 3, body. Along with this, we should discard the dualistic spatial metaphor of inner and outer and employ the visual trope of 1, introspectable mental processes, or interiority as witnessed by the mind's eye, 2, invisible mental processes, non-conscious cognition, and 3, the visible world, which includes our body and the environment. Recent work in cognitive science strongly supports the premise that most thinking is done non-consciously. By recognizing a third element, invisible mental processes, an entire world of encyclopedic knowledge and complicated processes are acknowledged that accounts for the tremendous amount of labor going on within our minds. These invisible mental processes also account for the apparent automaticity, spontaneity, and unthinkingness of much of our actions. The most common and misleading understanding is that introspection is some type of mental mirror that copies what we perceive. Equating conscious interiority with perception, as if interiority merely mirrored bodily sensations, is the fourth barrier. The perception theory of interiority is the most obstinate, commonly held, and entrenched view of the nature of psyche. It is important to argue not that this theory is sort of wrong. Rather, this theory is wrong in the most fundamental sense. There is something very commonsensical about the belief that interiority is perceptual experience, and confusing introspectable consciousness with what we perceive has puzzled thinkers for centuries. It is, however, easy to demonstrate that the two are very different. That interiority does not reflect the outside world is clear since, to quote Jaynes, what you can consciously recall is a thimbleful to the huge oceans of your actual knowledge. Our introspection only reflects a very limited portion of our perceptual bodily experiences. Moreover, people, quote, are not conscious of very much of what they sense. People are not conscious of very much of what they think. People are not conscious of very much of what they do. The very language we use to describe psychophysiological processes requires an overhaul. Let us avoid confusion by labeling non-conscious cognition reactivity, the way Jaynes did, rather than perception. Reactivity includes, to quote Jaynes, all stimuli my behavior takes into account of in any way, while consciousness is something quite distinct and a far less ubiquitous phenomenon. We are conscious of what we are reacting to only from time to time. Remarkably, to quote another observer, an astonishing number of textbooks in physiology and neuropsychology fail to mention this. An understanding of reactivity allows us to see through the illusions of conscious interiority. To quote another observer, we experience sensation but do not experience that this sensation has been interpreted and processed. The processing is a task of non-consciousness. People experience far more than what they consciously register. An example of reactivity is proprioception, or the largely non-conscious sense of where one's body parts are in space. Of course, its impairment is related to the loss of body sense, or body ego. The fifth barrier concerns ignoring anomalous psychological behaviors such as hypnosis, spiritualists, mediums, automatic writing, glossolalia, spirit possession, and poetic and religious frenzy. Though anthropology and ethnology have explored these fascinating phenomena, they need to be incorporated into mainstream psychology in a more robust theoretical manner. I want to conclude with the final barrier, which concerns ignoring history, or some of us do, as a source of evidence, insights, and leads for appreciating the psychic diversity and psychic plasticity of the human condition. This last barrier actually returns us to the first barrier, or the lack of amazement at the existence of conscious interiority. Through a careful reading of psychohistory, we can come to see just how profound the transformation of the human condition has been. The need for historically informed and culturally sensitive psychology cannot be overemphasized. Culture has the effect and impact of evolution minus genetic mutation. If we understand the significance and role of interiority, then we will also understand that Homo sapiens is the only species that can evolve without major alterations in its physical nature. This virtual evolution is possible because of culture or exogenetic information. And interiority is a specific development of human culture. I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.